My name is Elizabeth Miller. I'm 45 years old, and until a specific rainy Sunday dinner back in March, I honestly thought I knew exactly who my husband was. I thought I knew the contours of my own life, the boundaries of my marriage, and the hidden mechanics of the family I had married into. But looking back, I realize how easy it is to mistake a long habit for a safe harbor. Before we dive into the deep end of how a single evening completely dismantled my entire world, I want you to do something for me. Pull up a chair, grab your coffee, or whatever you happen to be drinking right now, and let's talk for a moment. Let's talk about the exact second you realize you are completely invisible to the people who are supposed to hold your hand. If you've ever had to quietly earn your place in your own life, while everyone else just took theirs for granted. If you've ever felt like your presence was only tolerated because of what you could provide, then you know exactly the kind of heavy, silent knot I'm talking about. Drop a comment right now and type the word viable if you've ever had to wake up to that realization. I want to see how many of us have been there. It was a completely ordinary weekend evening at my mother-in-law Margaret's house. The entire dining room smelled heavily of rosemary chicken and those expensive beeswax candles she always insisted on lighting, even when it was just a regular, casual family gathering. It was all part of the theater she loved to maintain. John's family was seated across from us, operating in their usual, deeply practiced rhythm. His father, Frank, sat rigidly at the head of the table like he still ran a major corporation, even though he had been retired and struggling for years. Margaret sat right beside him, dabbing her mouth delicately with a cloth napkin after literally every single bite of food, maintaining the illusion of absolute refinement. Then there was Diane, John's younger sister. She was text messaging under the table, her face illuminated by the faint blue glow of her screen, entirely convinced that absolutely nobody noticed her lack of presence or her complete disinterest in anyone else's life. Suddenly, my phone buzzed directly in my lap. I glanced down and felt my chest tighten the absolute second I saw my mother's name, Linda, flash across the screen. I excused myself quietly, stepping into the cold, dark hallway to answer it. My heart was already racing before she even uttered a single word, because my mother never called during a family dinner unless something was deeply wrong. "Lizzie, honey, it's your father," my mom said. Her voice sounded incredibly thin, fragile, and careful. It was that specific, heartbreaking tone she always used when she was terrified of becoming a financial burden to me, always apologizing before she even stated the problem. "The good news is the doctor says the medical treatments actually worked. But the hospital bills, honey, we're just short this month. I truly hate to even ask you. I know things are tight with you and John." "Don't you dare apologize, Mom," I whispered back, my voice shaking slightly as I pressed my forehead against the cool hallway wallpaper. "I've got it. I will handle it completely. You just focus on taking care of Dad." I hung up, took a deep breath, and walked back into that warm, bright dining room, with my chest feeling absolutely hollow from the sound of her voice. I sat back down, picked up my silverware, cut into my chicken, and tried to say it as casually and calmly as I could possibly manage. "Hey everyone," I said, looking around the table, trying to catch John's eye. "So, my dad had a medical procedure recently. Everything went well, luckily, but there are some lingering insurance and hospital bills. I'm going to help them out financially this month to get them clear of it." I didn't ask for anyone's permission. To be completely honest, I had never felt the need to ask before. In our 6 entire years of marriage, John had never once questioned where a single dollar of my personal paycheck went. And sitting there in that candlelit room, looking at the smooth, untroubled faces of his family, the ugly truth finally began to crystallize in my mind. He had never questioned my spending because for 6 years, my hard-earned money had exclusively gone toward funding his family's life, not mine. I had been the silent scaffolding holding up the Miller family empire, while my own parents were drowning in medical debt. The second the words left my mouth, the rhythm of the dinner table ground to a sudden, mechanical halt. John set his fork down. Not with a clatter, but slowly, deliberately, placing it perfectly parallel to his knife. It's the kind of heavy, calculated silence that tells you a storm is loading itself behind someone's eyes. He didn't look at me right away. He just stared at his plate for 3 agonizing seconds before finally lifting his gaze to meet mine. "Your parents, your problem," he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Your money is yours. My money is mine." The room went quiet in that very specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone already agrees with what was just said, and they are simply waiting to see if you will be foolish enough to argue. I looked around the table, watching the micro expressions of the people I had spent over a decade trying to please. Margaret didn't look up from her plate, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch into a tiny, barely disguised smirk of approval. Frank gave a single, slow nod, like a judge confirming a righteous verdict from the bench. Diane just kept scrolling on her phone, completely unbothered, as if that devastating sentence was the most normal thing in the world to utter to a spouse. Nobody defended me. Nobody even blinked. I sat there, holding a fork full of mashed potatoes, and something inside me went incredibly still, incredibly clear, like muddy water settling after you finally stop stirring it. Let me ask you a rhetorical question here, and I want you to really think about it while you take a sip of your drink. Have you ever looked at the face of someone you loved for 11 years, the face you built an entire existence around, and watched it distort into an absolute stranger? If you have ever had to keep your absolute composure while your entire heart shattered into a million sharp pieces, do me a quick favor. Type the word boundaries in the comments right now. Because in that exact moment of betrayal, sitting in the thick silence of that dining room, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. Instead, I actually smiled at him. John saw that smile and visibly relaxed, deeply satisfied with himself, thinking he had just won a minor domestic debate. Margaret finally looked up, pleased that the brief tension had passed. Diane put her phone down just long enough to ask if there was any more chicken left in the kitchen. They all thought the conversation was over. They thought I had backed down and accepted my place at the bottom of the priority list. But what John didn't realize, sitting there so smugly pleased with his own cruel logic, was that he hadn't silenced me. He had just handed me the exact rule I had been waiting 6 long years for someone to say out loud. He had just given me permission to take it all back. I finished my dinner calmly. I even laughed at Frank's dry joke about the neighbor's misbehaved dog. I helped Margaret clear the heavy plates, rinsing them under warm, soapy water while she chatted away about her summer garden. She had absolutely no idea that she was chatting with a woman who had just quietly decided to stop being her personal bank. Driving home that night, John reached over and squeezed my hand on the console like nothing unusual had happened, like he hadn't just drawn a line in permanent ink across our marriage. "Dinner was nice," he murmured smoothly. "It really was," I answered, watching the yellow streetlights slide across the windshield, and I meant it. It had been a very, very informative dinner. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. It wasn't born out of blind anger, and it wasn't born out of petty spite. It was born out of pure cold arithmetic. If my money was mine and his money was his, then for the first time in 6 years, I was finally going to follow the strict rules of our marriage exactly as they had been written by my husband. John just had absolutely no idea yet that the rules applied both ways. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay there in the dark next to him, listening to the rhythmic sound of his slow, untroubled breathing. He slept like a baby, like a man who had said something entirely ordinary at dinner, instead of a man who had just single-handedly ended a massive financial arrangement he didn't even realize existed. Around 1 in the morning, I gave up on the illusion of sleep entirely. I threw off the covers, went downstairs into the quiet of my home office, and opened up my laptop. I told myself I just wanted to look at the numbers. That was the polite, safe version of what I was actually doing. I logged into my personal checking account, the one that had been mine since long before we ever got married. It was the account John had never once asked to see because he assumed, quite correctly based on his own logic, that it wasn't his business. I pulled up 6 years of bank statements, and then I opened a blank spreadsheet. I am the kind of person who needs to see a thing completely in black and white before I let myself fully believe it. Let me pause here and ask you a very real question. If you are sitting here listening to this over your coffee, have you ever looked at your own bank history and realized you were entirely funding your own betrayal? Drop a comment below and write numbers if you know the feeling of looking at data that changes how you see your life. As I scrolled through the pages, the transfers were all right there, tidy, systematic, and recurring, like a second mortgage I'd been paying on a house I didn't even live in. There was $2,200 a month going directly to Margaret and Frank's landlord, dating all the way back to the year they sold their place in Ohio and moved into that luxury rental right near us. John had sworn to me at the time that the arrangement was completely temporary, just until they got on their feet. 6 years later, I was still paying it. Then there was the $30 a month for Diane's car insurance. I had started covering that right after her messy divorce because she was crying and broke, and I just never stopped because nobody ever told me to stop. There were the constant utility overages, hundreds of dollars extra every single season, because Frank refused to turn the air conditioning down or adjust the heat. I scrolled further and found the dental work, the family trip to Florida 2 years ago, the exact trip I paid for entirely, yet wasn't invited to go on because John told me it was just going to be a private family thing. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the screen reflecting off my face, and did the math 3 separate times because I didn't trust my own eyes the first 2 times. It was $2,500 and change, every single month, out of my account for 6 years. That is over $180,000, and not a single dollar of it had ever come from John's paycheck. Every transfer had my name on it, but every single ounce of gratitude in that family had gone directly to him. I let that freezing reality settle into my bones. I sat there in the dark, watching the cursor blink on my spreadsheet, and I realized something that made my stomach turn. John wasn't just letting me help his parents. He had built an entire psychological maze to protect his own fragile ego at my expense. He wasn't a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. No, he was far more cunning than that. He was a man who deeply craved the status of being the successful, generous son who had made it. But he wanted to buy that adoration using my labor while keeping his own money perfectly safe and untouched. To give you an idea of how deep this illusion went, let me share a quick moment that replayed in my mind. 3 years ago, Margaret called us crying about a $4,000 roof repair. John was traveling in Chicago for work that entire month. I sat right at this exact desk, took out my personal credit card, and paid the contractor directly so his parents wouldn't stress. A few weeks later at Easter brunch, I overheard Margaret proudly telling her book club how John really stepped up for us this year and handled the roof. John was standing right next to her, sipping his mimosa, smiling and nodding, absorbing the praise for a bill he hadn't contributed a single dime toward. Every single time I had ever hesitated, however briefly, about another financial request from his family, John would soften his voice, look at me with those puppy dog eyes and say, "But Liz, they're family." He had a specific, warm, manipulative cadence whenever he was defending his mother's lavish spending habits. Yet, the moment the subject shifted to my own father needing a lifeline for genuine medical bills, that warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, transactional ice. Your parents, your problem. I want to be completely honest with you right now, because this isn't a dramatic story about a woman who suddenly discovers she's a victim, screams, and throws a glass of red wine across a white rug. I wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. I was calm, unnervingly calm. It's the kind of absolute clarity you get when a decision stops being emotional and becomes purely structural. It's like discovering a main support beam in your house has been quietly rotting for years. And suddenly, in a single flash of light, you finally understand exactly why the floors have been creaking under your feet. I picked up my phone. It was 1:15 in the morning. I opened a text thread with my financial advisor, Carol. She's a brilliant, no-nonsense woman I've trusted since long before I ever met John. I didn't want to call and wake anyone up, so I just typed out a message. Need to talk tomorrow morning. About restructuring some automatic transfers. Nothing urgent, just finally ready to make a permanent change. Carol, who I swear never actually sleeps, shot a text back within 10 minutes. Whenever works for you. Everything okay? I stared at the screen, a slow, steady breath leaving my lungs. Everything is about to be, I wrote back. The next morning, I was sitting in the leather chair in Carol's office, watching my coffee go cold in my hand while she pulled up my accounts on her large monitor. I didn't mince words. I told her I wanted every single recurring transfer to the Miller family, the rent assistance, Diane's insurance, the utility buffers, canceled completely, effective the 1st of next month. I also asked her to help me open a brand new, entirely separate account that John couldn't see, specifically designated to fund whatever my own parents needed. Something clean, something completely honest, something that wasn't built on someone else's hypocritical rules. Carol didn't ask a million probing questions. She has a spectacular talent for reading a room without needing a full theatrical explanation. She just typed quietly, confirmed the cancellations, and slid a piece of paper across the desk for my signature. Done, she said, looking me dead in the eye. These stop on the 1st. I signed my name, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt a massive, invisible fist unclench directly inside my chest. That afternoon, an official email landed in my inbox with a cold, formal subject line, "Recurring payments canceled confirmation." I read it twice, letting the reality of those words wash over me before closing my laptop and going about the rest of my day like it was any other typical Tuesday. I went to the grocery store, picked up the dry cleaning, and cooked a quiet dinner with John. He spent the entire evening talking animatedly about a high-stakes meeting at his firm, and I sat across from him, nodding in all the exact right places, playing my role perfectly. There was no petty argument, no explosive confrontation, and no dramatic announcement made across the kitchen island. I didn't need one. John had already given me the exact words I needed, free of charge, in front of his entire family as witnesses. Your money is yours. My money is mine. I was simply the very first person in our household who was willing to actually live by the law he had laid down. But let me tell you, living in that silent space is a strange, psychological journey. For 19 full days, I lived a double life in complete serenity. I woke up next to him, made his coffee, and packed his lunches, all while knowing that a massive financial clock was ticking loudly in the background. Have you ever had to sit in absolute silence, holding a secret that you know will completely alter the landscape of your relationship, just waiting for the clock to run out? If you've ever had to master the art of emotional poker, drop a comment below and type patient, because that is exactly what I was. I was patient. During those 19 days, my mind constantly kept drifting back to our very early days as a couple, trying to figure out exactly where the tracks had shifted. 6 years ago, right after we got married and moved into our first home, John had taken my hands in his, looked deeply into my eyes, and said, "What's mine is yours, Liz. We're a team now, and we take care of our own." It sounded so beautiful, so profoundly supportive at the time. But now, with the spreadsheet burned into my retinas, I realized the sinister subtext of that conversation. He had structurally set me up to be the default, unconditional safety net for his people, quietly offloading his family responsibilities onto my shoulders, while shielding his own cash from ever being diminished. Every single time his family had a financial hiccup, it was automatically filtered through my account under the guise of marital teamwork. But the second my own family truly needed that team to step up, The illusion of unity vanished into thin air. That night, lying in bed, I thought about my father sitting in his old fabric recliner, a man far too proud to ever ask twice for help, and my mother's careful, apologetic voice on the phone. I thought about how quickly, how smoothly, and how quietly I would help them now, entirely free from needing anyone's permission or validation. I wouldn't have to defend my own flesh and blood to a panel of entitled in-laws who had never once stood up to defend me. John rolled over in his sleep, murmuring something incoherent about being tired, and drifted back off within minutes. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling strangely light and unburdened for a woman who had just detonated a massive financial bomb in absolute total silence. He had absolutely no idea what he had started. He genuinely believed our conversation had ended at that Sunday dinner table. It hadn't ended. It had only just begun, and the very first payment was due to disappear in exactly 24 hours. The phone rang at exactly 8:14 on the morning of the 1st, and I didn't even need to look at the glowing screen to know whose name would be sitting there in bold letters. Margaret. I let it ring twice while I calmly finished pouring my morning coffee. It wasn't done out of petty cruelty, but out of absolute habit. I've simply never liked answering a phone when my hands are full. When I finally slid my finger across the screen and picked up, her voice came through incredibly sharp, clipped, and completely stripped of its usual sugary, performative warmth. Elizabeth, there's a major problem with the automatic rent transfer, she said, without even offering a basic greeting. It didn't come through this morning. That's exactly right, Margaret, I said, keeping my tone perfectly even, almost pleasant, as I took a slow sip of my coffee. I stopped it. There was a massive, heavy pause on the line, the distinct kind of silence where you can practically hear someone's brain scrambling to completely recalculate their entire psychological understanding of a person they thought they controlled. You stopped it, Elizabeth? Her voice cracked slightly, the panic finally bleeding through the cracks of her aristocratic veneer. We completely depend on that money to survive. Frank's pension doesn't cover the difference for this house. You know that very well. I do know that, Margaret, I replied smoothly. But John was incredibly clear to me at dinner the other night. My money is mine, and his money is his. I am simply following the new rule he laid down for our family. If you need assistance with your rent, you'll need to speak directly with your son. The silence that followed was longer this time, and infinitely heavier. Margaret didn't have a single pre-packaged response ready, because in 6 full years, she had never once needed to defend her right to my bank account. I told her I truly hoped they'd figure it out, politely wished her a good morning, and ended the call before she could recover enough emotional leverage to argue. I finished my coffee standing right at the kitchen window, watching a neighbor walk her dog through the morning mist, feeling strangely unbothered by my own total composure. I had expected to feel a massive wave of something bigger, triumph perhaps, or even a lingering shred of guilt. Instead, I just felt clear, like a dirty window that had finally been washed after years of accumulated grime. John came home from work that evening already heavily agitated. His tie was completely loosened, and his jaw was set tight in that specific rigid way I recognized from years of watching him absorb bad news before he was ready to hand it off to someone else. My mother called me, he said, dropping his keys onto the kitchen counter much harder than necessary. She says you canceled the rent payment. I did, I said, turning around to face him fully, wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. Elizabeth, what on earth is wrong with you? He hissed, stepping closer, his face flushing red. You're seriously punishing my entire family over one single comment I made at dinner. I'm not punishing anyone, John, I said calmly, looking at him with absolute serenity. You sat at that table and said your money is yours and my money is mine. I agreed with you. I am simply keeping my personal money to myself exactly the way you asked me to. That's completely different. He shot back quickly, the words flying out of his mouth before he had clearly thought them through. Different how, exactly? I asked, tilting my head, waiting for the logic. He opened his mouth to deliver a lecture, then closed it just as fast. I watched him frantically search his brain for a viable answer, the exact way you watch someone desperately pat down their pockets for car keys. They suddenly aren't sure they brought with them. "It's just, they're my parents, Liz," he stammered, his voice dropping an octave. "It's not the same thing as some cold financial transaction." "It wasn't a cold transaction when I was quietly covering your sister, Diane's car insurance for 2 full years after her divorce either," I said quietly, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "But I don't remember you calling that different back then." He had absolutely no answer for that. For the very first time in 11 years of marriage, I watched my husband stand in our own kitchen with absolutely nothing to say. And something about that silence felt far more honest than any conversation we'd had in a very long time. Before he could even attempt to craft a recovery, John's phone buzzed aggressively on the counter. Then it buzzed again. Diane's name lit up the glass screen in bright, unforgiving letters, and he practically lunged for it, stepping quickly into the adjoining living room to take the call. I stood still in the kitchen, listening to his voice drop into that low, exhausting, placating tone he had spent years perfecting. The tone of a man constantly managing his sister's fragile adult emotions instead of ever addressing her actual behavior. I couldn't hear every single syllable through the doorway, but after years of being his wife, I didn't need to. I caught the sharp, panicked fragments cutting through the air. Insurance lapse, cancellation notice, and John frantically whispering, "Don't panic, Diane, I'll figure it out." Diane's car insurance was officially due, and for the first time since her divorce, nobody was quietly executing a back-end bank transfer to cover her tracks. Later that evening, while we were silently getting ready for bed, the second phone call arrived. This time it was Frank. I watched John's posture shift instantly into something much firmer, more defensive, the tragic tone of an adult, son trying to sound like a commanding protector, while simultaneously absorbing a severe scolding from his father. "Dad, listen, I will talk to her," John muttered, pacing the bedroom floor. "Just give it a few days." A pause. "No, Dad, I'm not going to just let it slide. I said I'll handle it." He hung up the phone, threw it onto his nightstand, and looked over at me with a heavy, expectations-laden gaze, completely waiting for an apology. I offered absolutely none. I simply pulled back the crisp cotton covers, slipped into bed, and picked up my book exactly the same as any other ordinary night. "Frank wants to talk to you directly, Liz," John said, his voice tightly wound. "He says he wants to handle this entire situation like an adult." "He is more than welcome to call me himself, John," I said without looking up from my page. "But I need you to understand that nothing is going to change. I'm not reinstating a single automatic transfer. The accounts remain closed." John sat heavily on the very edge of our mattress for a long, grueling moment, his shoulders hunched forward like a defeated boxer, staring at his phone like it might magically rearrange its digits into a completely different conversation if he just looked at it long enough. I watched him from where I lay, studying the exact contours of the man I had known for over a decade. I was watching him confront, for the very first time in his entire life, the solid shape of a real boundary instead of the yielding comfort of a blind assumption. I felt absolutely no urge to comfort him. I felt no urge to explain my logic further. I had already explained myself with flawless perfection, using his own exact words, at his own mother's dinner table, in front of his own family. He finally reached out, set the phone face down on the wood nightstand, and turned off the bedside lamp. But I could tell from the erratic, shallow pattern of his breathing that he wasn't sleeping either. Somewhere out there in that thick, heavy darkness, I imagined him running the brutal numbers in his head for the first time in 6 long years. They were numbers he had never once had to think about because I had always quietly, invisibly handled them for him. 30 days. That is exactly how long the leases, the luxury insurance policies, and the utility grace periods would hold their breath before real, unmitigated consequences started landing on real doorsteps. 30 days before, the family that had never once bothered to say thank you to me for anything would have to explain to themselves exactly how they'd been living for 6 years, and more importantly, at whose expense. When that month finally drew to a close, John tried to orchestrate an emotional ambush. He called an emergency family meeting at our house. It was entirely his choice, not mine. He wanted the comfort of our living room, the familiar layout, the home court advantage where emotional manipulation could thrive. But I refused to let our home become a theater for their entitlement. I contacted Carol and changed the rules of the game entirely. I moved the meeting to absolute neutral ground, a stark, daylight-drenched, professional conference room at Carol's financial consulting firm. And I did one more thing that John never saw coming. I invited my own parents, Robert and Linda. When the Saturday afternoon meeting arrived, the psychological contrast in that room was heartbreakingly immediate. My parents arrived first. My father walked in slower than he used to, leaning his weight slightly on my mother's fragile arm. But he had put on his very best wool sweater and shook Carol's hand with the quiet, profound dignity of a man attending an important boardroom meeting. My mother sat close beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, asking for absolutely nothing, expecting absolutely nothing, the exact way she always has. Then John's family filed into the room like a political delegation arriving to negotiate a bitter surrender, except they genuinely seemed to believe that I was the one who owed them an apology. Margaret sat stiffly on the edge of her ergonomic mesh chair, clutching her designer purse in her lap like a shield of armor. Frank stood near the large glass windows with his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set rigidly in the particular way of a man rehearsing a grand speech he thinks will land harder if he remains standing. Diane perched on the far side of the table, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, holding her phone like a life raft. John stood near the doorway, desperately trying to position himself as the neutral mediator, the peaceful diplomat trying to calm down two warring factions, completely blind to the fact that one of those factions was his own wife, and the other was a group of people who had been living comfortably off her stolen labor for 6 years. Margaret spoke first, her voice trembling with a carefully orchestrated mixture of deep hurt and sharp accusation. You knew we completely depended on that money to survive, Elizabeth. You knew, and you just went ahead and turned it off like our lives don't even matter to you. No, Margaret, I said, keeping my voice utterly calm and level as I looked across the long conference table. I was told explicitly by your son that my money is mine. I am simply the very first person in this family to actually believe him and live by it. Frank immediately stepped in, his voice booming across the room, deliberate and theatrical. This isn't about some casual comment made over a dinner plate, Elizabeth. This is about basic family loyalty. We have always treated you like one of our very own daughters in this family. I almost laughed out loud at that, but I didn't, because giving into laughter would have given his performance far more emotional heat than it actually deserved. Instead, I just stared at him steadily. Family loyalty, I repeated, letting the words hang in the stark boardroom air. That is an incredibly interesting choice of words, Frank. Considering my own father was fighting for his life in the hospital last month, and not a single person in this room ever picked up the phone to ask how he was doing. Nobody sent a card. Nobody even remembered his name. Nobody had an answer for that. Diane instantly looked down at her lap, her face flushing crimson. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, then closed right back up, completely empty of words. I didn't waste another second. I nodded toward Carol, and she opened her laptop, connecting it to the large monitor on the wall. For the next 20 minutes, Carol walked the room through 6 full years of meticulous financial documentation, calmly, professionally, and entirely without editorial drama. She laid out the rent contributions, the recurring insurance payments, the utility overages, the $4,000 roof repair, and the Florida trip that I had been excluded from. She read the numbers the way an accountant reads a balance sheet, completely devoid of judgment, which somehow made the absolute weight of the truth land infinitely harder than if I had delivered it myself, with tears running down my face. The total, Carol said, clicking to the final slide, is $2,500 a month for 72 months. That is just over $180,000 entirely funded from Elizabeth's personal accounts. The room went completely, devastatingly silent. Margaret's hand drifted slowly to her chest. Frank's arms uncrossed, and for the very first time since he had walked into the building, he looked less like a man delivering a verdict and more like a criminal, realizing he was the one standing trial. Diane finally spoke up, her voice incredibly small and cracked. I didn't know it was that much money. None of you did, I said, looking at each of them in turn, because none of you ever bothered to ask a single question in 6 years. You just assumed the safety net would always be there. I turned my gaze slowly toward John, who was staring at the floor, his face completely pale and his jaw working silently. I watched the story he had built about his own life completely collapse right in front of the very people he had lied to. There is just one more thing, I said, my voice steady and unhurried. You should probably ask John where he told you all this money was coming from in the first place. Every single head in that room turned toward my husband at once. John? Frank asked, his voice lower now, dangerously hard. Where did you tell your mother this money was coming from? John didn't answer right away. He stood there gripping the back of an office chair, like it was the only thing keeping him upright on the planet. I told them it was from us, John finally whispered, the words sounding incredibly heavy as they left his mouth. From our joint accounts. I told them I wanted to help out because I was doing so well at the firm. Use, I repeated softly, letting the hypocrisy of the word echo. There is no joint account for this, John. Every single transfer came from my personal checking. You never contributed a single dollar to any of it. Margaret turned toward her son slowly, her face going through a painful succession of confusion, disbelief, and finally, absolute grief. You told me you were taking care of us, she choked out, her voice cracking completely. You said you were so proud that you could finally give back to us after everything we did raising you. I wanted you to be proud of me, Mom, John said, his voice desperate. I watched him, and for a fleeting second, I almost felt a wave of pity for how small he looked. But then I remembered exactly whose money, whose late nights, and whose sacrifices had purchased that fake pride for him, and the pity vanished completely. The meeting closed without any cinematic fireworks. There were no hugs, no dramatic apologies, and nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of story. But as everyone silently filed out into the parking lot, Margaret paused beside me for just a brief second. Thank you, she whispered quietly, her eyes glistening with genuine, unperformed emotion. Thank you for being more honest with us than my own son was. I simply nodded and let that be enough. John walked beside me to our car in absolute, total silence. And somewhere in the depth of that silence, I think we both understood the exact same truth without ever needing to say it out loud. The money had only ever been the surface of our problems. What he was actually losing today was the illusion of control he had been relying on for years. In the weeks that followed, a deep, beautiful peace settled into my life. I took the money that used to vanish into the Miller family's luxury lifestyle and redirected it exactly where it had always belonged. I paid off the remainder of my father's medical bills in full. I hired a local contractor to completely fix the sagging front porch steps my parents had been stepping around for 2 years. My father actually cried when he saw the finished wood steps. He's not a man who cries loudly. It was just a quiet welling in his eyes as he sat in his recliner, waving his hand like he was embarrassed by his own immense gratitude. You didn't have to do all this, Lizzie, he whispered. We managed just fine before. I know you did, Dad, I said, sitting on the arm of his chair and taking his weathered hand in mine. But you shouldn't have to just manage anymore. This isn't charity, Dad. This is love. As for John, I didn't file for a messy divorce. At least, not yet. But I sat him down at our own kitchen table and laid out the new, unyielding terms for our marriage. Separate accounts stay entirely separate. Every major financial decision must be made out loud, together, at the same table. And we are currently in intense marriage counseling because I need to know if the man sitting across from me is actually capable of a deep psychological change, or if he is simply capable of being deeply sorry because he finally got caught. Meanwhile, the Miller family has adjusted the exact way adults do when an unearned safety net is finally removed from beneath them. Margaret and Frank downsized into a much smaller, realistic apartment that actually fits their pension. Diane took a second job at a medical office, and just last week, she called me entirely to share, almost sheepishly, that she had made her very first car payment completely on her own, and that it felt strangely good. A few nights ago, I sat at my parents' cozy kitchen table. My mom had made her famous pot roast, and my dad was happily telling the exact same fishing story he has told 100 times before. Halfway through dinner, my phone lit up on the wood table with John's name flashing across the glass. I looked at it for a brief second, feeling the old, heavy pull of 11 years of habit. Then, I calmly turned the screen face down, took a bite of my dinner, and went right back to listening to my father's voice. He told me my money was mine, so I finally completely believed him. If you have made it this far with me over your coffee, I want to ask you a final question. Do you think a marriage can truly recover after this level of betrayal, or has something fundamental already been permanently broken? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from tonight, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another deep, calm drama story.